let's go ahead and get started. Great. So I'm Chris. If you've seen me on Drupal.org, I go by EclipseGC there. I do a lot of things that hopefully have positively affected people's lives. I am one of the co-maintainers for CTools. I'm a Drupal 8 contributor. I'm like a subsystem maintainer for the plugin system. And I'm a senior software engineer over at Acquia. Specifically, I help with our Content Hub product by being the tech lead there. And I'll actually talk about that a little bit. This session isn't a pitch for what we do there, but a lot of what we do there informs this session. So there's like a lot of good kind of interesting stuff there. I have a multi-year focus on page layout. So I've been heavily involved in things like Layout Builder, Panels, Panelizer, Page Manager for many, many years now. And I also at this point have a multi-year focus on data model replication strategies. And I'll touch on that just a tiny bit as well during this. So data modeling. If we're going to get into this, let's talk just a little bit about it. First question, of course, is what is this? And from a technical perspective, data modeling is a subset of what we refer to as information architecture. But fundamentally, it's really just how do you store your data, where do you put your fields, and how is that data related from one item to another. So within Drupal terms, you're going to expect us to talk about entity references. Indeed, that's exactly what we're going to kind of touch on here. I have kind of a special way that I like to think about entity references that I want to kind of communicate here. But entity references are really, really powerful. We use them all the time. Drupal uses them in just baseline Drupal a lot. The regular entities that are installed for everyone with like a standard installation have a number of different interrelated entity references on them. And their power is due to things like their ability to be data typed. If you want to reference users, you can forcefully reference just users. Or if you want to reference just articles, you can just reference articles. They're multilingual, so we can have different references for different languages of the same entity. They're revisionable. We can have more than one of them. If you see this term cardinality, that's what that means. In short, they follow the same rules as the Drupal field system does. So we do things like change references per revision too with them, where one version of a node may be referenced a completely different author. So Drupal core does this too, where people who come in and make changes to a node, they're the revision author, not necessarily the node author, but we know that a particular user was the author of a given revision, and we keep track of that over time. We also do the other way. Paragraphs does this, if there are any Paragraphs users, where we'll reference a specific revision of an entity. So entity reference revisions does this, and it allows us to do things like tie a current node revision to a particular paragraph revision. Yeah, entity reference revisions module does this, and Paragraphs uses that. So having said all of that, I want to kind of challenge some of the preconceived notions here by telling you that in my opinion, entity references are also the foundation of most data problems. And I'm going to provide a couple of examples here. So I have an example for Drupal 7 and an example for Drupal 8. So let's talk about Drupal 7. Drupal 7 isn't ancient history at this point. We're still supporting it for, I think, well into 2021. So there are still sites out there who are using these sorts of approaches. And the particular story I want to tell is a Drupal Commerce story. Now, full disclosure, I've worked for Acquia for almost 6 years now, and I worked for Drupal, I worked for Commerce Guys for 4 years before that. So I have a lot of experience with Drupal Commerce, and I've seen a lot of interesting setups there. Some good, some bad. This one was not great. And so in terms of how they actually set this up, I had a customer who had, of course, stereotypical product displays, which are nodes in Drupal 7, and product variants, which are a custom entity type. And the relationship of these things was such that they also wanted to relate other products together by saying, oh, these are related products, right? And if you're not familiar with what product variants are, just to kind of like level set on that, a product variant is like you can think of it in terms of t-shirt sizes. You might have a t-shirt with some graphic on it and you want to sell a small, a medium, and a large version. They're all the same product, but they're different product variations, right? And so in this case, what the customer had done was they had created all of these different product variations and linked them together based upon products that were related. And because of the nature of their products, they ended up with over 700,000 different product variations in their system. And now, normally that would be a very large profile of products, but it wasn't in their case for a couple of instances. And what was interesting about this was because of the interrelated nature of their data, they could have single pages that referenced as many as 64,000 other product variants on page load. Now that's a lot of entity loading to deal with all at once. And so in order to even get a page up and running, we had to do things like set timeouts to be over 30 minutes just to cache one page. And then once the page was cached, you couldn't do any AJAX on the page to do things like change product variation because each product variation load had to go through this same sort of process. And so it was just absolutely positively not going to work ever for them. So I came in, I took a look at what was going on here, and the way we fixed this was we actually just changed some elements of their data model. And by doing this, we actually got 1,000-to-1 compression of variance. We went from 700,000 products to 700 products. And so we did this by moving fields that didn't affect price off of variance and onto line items. And so if you've ever done any Drupal commerce and you found yourself with a ton of variance and not really knowing like how to handle that, one of the little like tricks of the commerce trade is that, you know, if you have things that you might consider variations, but they don't actually affect the price of your product any, those things can be put on custom line item types. And just even knowing that this kind of data reshuffling is possible is really, really powerful to change kind of the nature of your data model. So now I'm going to talk about a Drupal 8 horror story. And unfortunately, this is one that most of you are going to be familiar with to one degree or another. So full disclosure, I'm not a big paragraphs fan. I know that a lot of people use it today, and I think that it has its place, but I think that some of the ways that we're using it as a community are actually really bad practice going forward. So one of these is specifically around layout. And as I mentioned early on, I have a multi-year focus on layout and have helped to build many of those tools. So one of the things that we see a lot with paragraphs these days is people wanting to just use it in order to lay out a page. And so they'll end up creating different like layout bundles where maybe they have 1 column and 2 column and 3 column paragraphs, and then they'll nest paragraphs inside of paragraphs in order to create more complicated layouts. And so I've seen this a lot where we end up with nested layout bundles with some sort of data component sitting inside of them. And you know, this customer that I was talking with who had this situation, they told me that they had 50 gig data tables just holding entity reference revisions from all of the data manipulation that they had done. And if that's accurate, I haven't seen these tables for myself, but if that's accurate, that's really just an enormous table holding integers. And I'm actually going to kind of show a demo of this here in a couple minutes. So is there a happy ending to this one? There's really not. So much of what we're doing around this today results in an enormous amount of kind of cruft in the database. And there are whole modules being built just to try to clean up after this and kind of rectify it. But it could be worse. At least we have entity reference autoloading. So situations like the one that I outlined in Drupal 7, they can still happen in Drupal 8, but you have to go to a lot of effort to make them happen. In this case, we weren't seeing things like that. So while we're talking about fields that reference stuff, I want to just pause for a moment and point out that the entity reference field isn't the only field that references things. If you're going to look at your data model, you need to kind of look at it holistically. And there's some things that you can modify and some things that you can't. So I'll talk a bit about both of those. So obviously, we have an author field in the case of things like nodes, and I'm sure that you knew that was an entity reference. We also have taxonomy terms, and those are obviously references too. But did you know that every taxonomy term has a parent? And so if it's a hierarchical taxonomy vocabulary, when you're looking at one term, you could actually be looking at a reference to many different terms up the stream. Of course, we have traditional image and file fields. We also have media references, which I don't go into at all, but it's like an extra layer of abstraction from an entity perspective around all of this. And I know we're all moving to it, and I think that it's a good thing to be using, but people should really be aware of exactly what we're getting into here. Links. Link fields are entity references, at least if they're done internally. So if I have, one page of a site that references another page of the same site, and those are done via entities, then, I do a lot of data replication. And if I want to replicate that data, it means that I actually now have to reach completely across a site to a totally, what might have seemed unrelated piece of content, and pull it across with, just in order to maintain all of these sorts of connections. As of Drupal 8.8, path aliases. These are entities, and they're revisionable entities. So that's worth knowing. The underlying workflow, if you're doing any sort of workflow management for your content, these are all entities too. Then layout builder. I mentioned, I helped build Layout Builder, and underneath the hood, Layout Builder can reference a whole bunch of things. Like it references blocks. If one of those blocks were a view, that's an entity. It can also reference custom blocks. So, Drupal has long had the ability to create custom block types that you can just put content in. And this is actually in many ways very similar to paragraphs from a data storage mechanism, but we have this as well. Formatted text. This one's actually my favorite because the formatted text field, most people don't think about it as being an entity reference, but it actually is an entity reference in many, many different ways. Because if you have a text formatter, that's a config entity. If you start doing things like entity embedding for media or images or that sort of data, then your text could actually have many different entities in it. And so there are lots of different ways that this stuff is actually interrelated and locked together in a meaningful way. Of course, the entity bundle field, your node type isn't just a string. It's actually backed up by a whole other set of entities. And I like to think of these as being kind of invisible references. I'm also just going to take a moment and say that I love that I can use smaller text because we're all staring at roughly the same size screen. So invisible references, what do I mean when I say this? Well, not only is your node type also an entity, but you have form displays and view displays underneath all of this that are also entities. And those, you have at least one form display guaranteed if you're looking at a content entity, and one or more view displays if you're looking at a content entity. And when we get into those, they actually reference field config. And field config actually references field storage. And so it's just kind of turtles all the way down. So let's talk about a simple article. And I went ahead and I just put this one out here all at once. So we just can kind of process this. We've looked at a lot of these fields already, but obviously a simple standard Drupal article as it comes out of the standard install profile, it's going to have an author, a bundle, a taxonomy term in the form of tags, image, alias, form display, view display, field config, and field storage. And then it's going to do all of that again for every user, image, and taxonomy term that's associated with this. So if you boot up a new standard Drupal install and you go and you create a new article with one of everything in it, you're going to have somewhere around 40 entities as being dependencies of that one piece of content, okay? And I think that's really important to kind of understand, because if in 3 fields we can escalate to 40 entities, how many more are involved in the complex data models that we build today? And should we really be considering what it means to build these data models? So I'm going to take a couple minutes and I'm going to pick on paragraphs. We already know that I'm not a big fan here, but let's at least define what paragraphs is. Paragraphs, to me, is a simple entity that holds field data and is revisionable, okay? It's really useful for like grouping multiple fields together. So, I have a little example here where maybe you could imagine on a node, you want to have a list of users and what department they're in. So you might build a paragraph that has 2 fields on it. One, a user reference field, and another, a department select list, right? And you could potentially add as many of those as you want. And in this sense, it's actually really useful for building this sort of data modeling, because building compound fields like this in Drupal is actually a very difficult sort of task. The community, however, makes use of this for layout. And I've touched on this a little bit already. So we tend to create bundles with references to other paragraphs. And then each of those references becomes a column in some template layout that we're going to do. And we start nesting these together to make more complicated layouts, okay? This is very stereotypical. I've seen this out of Acquia. I've seen this like out of almost everybody. Everybody's done this at some point. And underneath the hood, entity reference revisions is storing paragraph revision IDs. And it links this stuff in a parent to child revision strategy, right? So if you have node revision ID 1, it can be referencing paragraph revision ID 1, or as you go forward, changing new revisions, you can get new revisions of each thing here. Unfortunately, Drupal can't tell when a user has actually interacted with its field or not. So if you hit the edit button on any page that has paragraphs on it, and you just hit save, you're going to get a whole new set of revisions each time. So it's needlessly creating these in the background. I'm actually going to show a demo of this just so you can kind of see exactly what's going on here. Ultimately, this adds a ton of cruft to your database, and it's complexity that your data model has to rectify at some point in the future, right? This is kind of like where we bury the bodies. So why don't I figure out how I'm going to demo this on 2 screens? Give me just a second. Okay, that is going to be a little big. Hold on. And of course, now I've lost it. All right, here we go. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so let's just make sure my server's running. Good, my server's running. Okay, so I went to the effort of going ahead and just creating some very simple stuff here. So I'll quickly kind of show you what I'm doing. I have a paragraphs page bundle for nodes. And if we look at that, it's just got one field on it for paragraphs, and it can reference any of the paragraph types that I've made. Then if I come in here and I look at paragraph types, you'll see I made an image, links, a text, and then I made a 2-column layout here. So while I'm at this, I'm going to get one more thing together. Okay. So this is SQL Pro. And this is SQL Pro for the site we're staring at. So I just want to look at paragraphs here so that, you know, there's no magic going on here. So we have paragraph item revisions, field data, and paragraph item revisions. So we'll come back to this in just a second. As you can see, I haven't created any content for this site. So let's go ahead and fix that. And I'll just make a new paragraph page, and this will be, you know, foo. And we're going to add a 2-column to it. And on the left, on the left, I'm going to add text. And then on the right, I'm going to add an image. Cool. And if I hit save on this, we're going to end up with about what you'd expect. We have a paragraph that says this is a foo, and I have my image here. And so if we come back over to SQL Pro and we take a look at this, you can see I got 3 new paragraphs in here, and I have, you know, various field data. And I'm just going to try to open this up a little bit to maximum on this screen. And so, you know, this is super simple. This is just 3 paragraphs on a page. Anybody who's kind of done this sort of workflow before with paragraphs knows that you're going to end up with dozens under most circumstances. So if I just hit edit and save again, so I'm not actually doing anything, then if we come over here and we refresh, we're going to have 6 of these revisions. Now, you can imagine if we start nesting and nesting and nesting data together, that this could get really nasty really quickly. And we don't even have to go so far as contriving a situation where we're just hitting edit and save. If you actually wanted to edit the data, you're going to hit edit, you're going to change one value of some paragraph somewhere and hit save, and all of the paragraphs on that page just got new revisions in your database. All of them except for one needlessly. And this is just kind of a shortcoming of actually how the Form API and Field API systems work together in the first place. So it's just worth knowing that this is what's happening underneath the covers of paragraphs when you're making use of it. Let's see if I can go back to my presentation. Cool. Can everybody see the presentation okay now?
Yes.
Yes.
So I've ragged on paragraphs a lot. Going to do just a tiny bit more, and then we'll move on. Under most circumstances, paragraphs would actually be better served from a data modeling perspective if you didn't use it and instead went to the effort of building a custom field type. There are far fewer entities involved when we're doing that because you really only have the entity that you're attaching the field to. So there's no new entity, you're just writing the plugins to do the work. This is going to be a superior data model 99% of the time. There's one very, very outside sort of edge case situation in which paragraphs is the only solution, but it's very, very uncommon. I've literally seen it once in my career. Unfortunately, this is a whole lot easier said than done. Building a new plugin for a custom field type is actually not all that trivial to do. It takes a little bit of effort, it takes a little bit of know-how, and probably today in the current like Drupal climate, if I was involved in a site build and I said to one of my developers, hey, why don't you just build a custom field type for that? They'd say, how about we just use paragraphs? So I think there's like some things that we kind of need to rectify as a community. One of the big things we could do is by making this process easier. I have some thoughts about that, but it's for a completely different discussion. Ultimately though, the objective when we're looking at custom field types would be that this is just data, there's no layout information. So I helped to build Layout Builder. Let's talk about this just a little bit because I feel like it's important to touch on it. I don't want to just pick on paragraphs the whole time and not provide any alternatives or any reasoning for my alternatives. So Layout Builder's in core these days. If you haven't played with it, I'd really encourage you to. Much like I was just saying in the previous slide, it's usually a whole lot better if you can build a custom field type for the data that you want to store. And that's precisely how Layout Builder actually stores its layout overrides. So, in Layout Builder, if you wanted to let each of your node articles have its own layout, we do this via field data. So we actually deploy a field to the node, and that field now holds layout data for the node. So we're leveraging custom field storage here. Underneath the hood, we use layout plugins and block plugins in order to actually visualize what's going to be on the screen. And we can use content blocks. Content blocks are, much like I defined paragraphs, they're a simple, revisionable, fieldable content type that comes default in core. And so if you've ever created new block content and just placed it somewhere, that was likely done with what I'm calling content blocks, or you might hear custom blocks. These are often interchangeable terms. So it's very similar to paragraphs in this regard. But the important thing to kind of keep in mind about how Layout Builder does this is Layout Builder deploys its own user interface for all of the interactions with the entities that are appearing there. And so because of that, we're not dependent on Form API and Field API in the same way that something like paragraphs would be. So we can actually tell when the data has changed, and we only make incremental updates as is relevant. So there's much less data cruft. And moreover, since there aren't any of these extra entities happening to kind of define how that data is going to be stored in the first place, it just ends up being generally cleaner. Also, if you're wanting to control the layout, I generally think it's better to have some sort of visual aid for that. And Layout Builder is exclusively trying to show people what their page is going to look like when they're done. So as a visual editing tool, I generally consider it to be in a completely different category. So let's take a couple minutes here and talk about Drupal data modeling best practices. And these are my best practices. I'm just trying to pass on a bit of what I've learned here. So these are kind of my guidelines. First and foremost, you should always limit the number of related entities. As we kind of dig into the bits that I'm going to show in a couple minutes here, you'll see why I think this is really important. But I hope some of the examples I've already given kind of, hit this home. The more entities you have collaborating together on a screen, the more there's a cost for doing that, okay? Don't use data modeling tools for page layout. I am specifically calling out paragraphs here. Paragraphs is a data modeling tool, and when it's used exclusively as a data modeling tool, a lot of the problems that we see with it are largely mitigated. When we use it as a page layout tool, it complicates the situation dramatically. If you're going to use paragraphs, definitely don't nest them. Again, there might be a handful of situations where that's necessary, but if you can avoid it, I would heavily encourage it. And finally, custom field types are always greater than paragraphs. If you have the technical expertise to build custom field types to hold your data, it's a far better place to be than having the data model that paragraphs is bringing along with it. So I've talked a lot about the underlying data modeling principles that we've got here, but I want to talk a little bit about when and where we reference things, because this is kind of one of those unseen choices that we tend to make, and I think we tend to make it incorrectly. So just keep in mind that with everything I'm about to say, there are always trade-offs. It doesn't matter which approach you use, there are going to be pros and cons to all of them. So the two most obvious kind of approaches here are parents referencing children and children referencing paragraphs. Children referencing parents. For reference, paragraphs kind of does both of these things. I'll talk about that a tiny bit. It's just worth noting. So let's talk about the first one, parents referencing children. This is fine under most circumstances if what you're doing is a one-to-one reference. So if you have some sort of parent node that needs to reference a child node and it needs to do that once, that's probably fine. It doesn't really matter where you put that data. But the second we start considering a situation where we want a parent to reference many children, there are a whole host of questions you need to stop and ask yourself, because this can get dicey really quickly. So the first question that I think people need to really kind of consider here is, how long are these references going to exist? And so I'm going to kind of contrive a project management tool just for the sake of this conversation. If you can imagine having like an organization that references projects and projects that reference tasks, this becomes really interesting really quickly, because if you guys are sitting in your Jira queues and dealing with stuff in that way, you wouldn't ever want to go look at your project and see 1,000 different tasks as part of the referencing of fields in there, right? So how many references are going to be there? Are we going to archive references over time? What does that look like? And there are UX considerations that kind of need to be made here. Like, if we're going to do this, what's the UX of it going to be? This is the most obvious kind of approach to doing this. And the Drupal community at large has built many tools around doing specifically this. If you've ever dealt with inline entity form, which was built in order to help facilitate how Drupal Commerce does many of the things it does, this is specifically the expectations that it has in order to work. Dan, do you want me to address that now, or should I hold it to the end for questions?
No, that's for the end.
Okay, cool. It's also the most dependency encumbered approach, and I keep saying I'll talk about that, so I will. Let's talk about children referencing parents. When you have a child referencing a parent, it's naturally one-to-one almost always. There may be some very like strange circumstances where a single child might reference multiple parents, but that's not super common. The more common thing is, again, kind of sticking with my project management example, like a task can say, this is my project. And we have the exact same relationship that we had in the other example already, except there's only one field to fill out. And there aren't multiple values ever. Of course, the downside to this is that if you're going to do it, you're going to have to set up queries or views in the Drupal sense to display at the parent layer so that you can see things like all of the related tasks. You aren't just going to get a field formatter that does that for you. I generally consider this UX to be simpler. There's probably more code to set it up properly, and I'll actually demo that here in a couple minutes. And the dependencies for it are much, much simpler as well. Also, things like my example of archiving, this sort of usage over time can be totally accounted for by the queries and views that you build. So, you know, if you want to show all tasks that are not currently archived, like that's a view you have probably built some version of in the past. Paragraphs, as I mentioned, does parent-child relationships. This is really obvious. This is how you interact with it. But it also has fields for parent type and parent ID if you actually look at the schema. And if you're interacting with it from a PHP perspective, it also has methods in order to load those parents. This is really important for my use case where I'm doing data replication. I have to know that sort of stuff because if someone were to programmatically edit a paragraph, I need to make sure that its chain of dependencies is still intact. This isn't really entity references though, like it's just field values that it's holding on to. And that's both good and bad depending on how you want to look at it. So I'm just calling it out here. In case you ever need it, know that paragraphs does have this reference. I'm going to kind of speed up here because I think I'm running towards the end of my time. So there's another topic here that I haven't covered at all, and it's when to create a new entity type. And I'm just going to give a few criteria here. If we're talking about data modeling, we have to acknowledge that you aren't stuck with the existing entities that Drupal ships. You can create your own. So a few things worth noting. You should only consider this if an existing entity type doesn't suffice. It's my doorbell. So ask yourself some questions. Is it a standalone page? It might be a node. Does it display many other items together? It might be a term or a view, right? Is it used on many pages independently? It might be a block, right? So whatever the case, just make sure that if you're building a new entity type, you have very specific special criteria that no other entity type is really matching for you. I will, however, throw out a quick warning that if you're going to do this, everything we've talked about up until this point is possible to happen on your custom entity types as well, if they are a typical content entity that's fieldable and bundleable and revisionable. So why do I know all this? As I mentioned earlier, I'm the tech lead for Acquia's Content Hub. And Content Hub, oh, okay, cool. Well, then we'll have plenty of time for questions. Thanks, Bob. Content Hub is a tool that does data replication, okay? So we released the 2x version of Content Hub last year sometime. And what we have to do with this tool, since it's a data replication and syndication engine, is that we actually need to identify all entity dependencies of any given entity. So that example of like a simple article that I gave earlier, that's a real example. It's not hypothetical. The software that my team and I write and maintain actually has to have the capability to navigate through all of that, find all of those dependencies, and put them in some sort of format that we can communicate from one Drupal site to another. And if we can't do that, then we can't succeed at our job, right? So we deal with data models all the time. And some of these data models are very simple, and some of these data models are very complicated. And sometimes the customer actually wants to dynamically resort their data models as they syndicate them. And that's a whole different ballgame. So what I want to do is I just want to kind of demo a couple of those ideas for you, and then we'll open it up for questions, and we can go from there. So let me grab my other window. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that we could think of things in terms of maybe something like a project management tool. And so what I actually did here was I went to the effort of building out like a really scaled down version of these two competing data model ideas so that we could see what they were doing underneath the hood. So let's start with data model A. And so if I come in here, I have a organization, Acquia, who has projects of Acquia Content Hub. And so like if I edit this and we look at it, you can see this is exactly what you expect it to be. It has projects here, it's inline entity references, and like, yes, I could have set things up maybe a little bit better so that these were auto-collapsing, which is what you want to do in the real world, but I only have like ones and twos of things, so it doesn't really matter for my use case. So you can see I have my reference to my project, and if I click into my project, you'll see my project references 3 different tasks that I can do. So, you know, we have an upcoming release here in the near-term future for 8x212. So I have just this blank task for it. And so again, this is very stereotypical. If I come in and I look at my project has 3 tasks under it. And if I wanted to add another, I totally could. And many people are using a model that looks very similar to this for page layout via paragraphs or for other data modeling tools that they have. And they start using things like inline entity form, complex, where they can start collapsing things and they have like individual edits. And those are all good things to be doing if you're going to go with this approach. So knowing that, I have a terminal window here somewhere. And of course, Zoom is over it. Sorry, hold on just a second. Okay, cool. So, I'm gonna use a tiny bit of the tooling that we actually built for Content Hub here. And so, in fact, I'll go ahead and I'll grab PHP Storm just so you guys can see this. Sorry, no session is safe. I have to get technical at some point. So within what we do within Content Hub, and this is just kind of like technical details, we actually want the ability to move data around. It's what we do. So in order to simulate this, sometimes I actually have Drush commands that let me do things like build a manifest file that says like, hey, I want to export the node we think of as this UUID and all of its dependencies. And so in that case, you can see this is model.a.yaml. And by doing that, I run my little Drush command. My Drush command gives me this. And this is a great big JSON value for every single entity that's required in order to make model A work. And you can see if I scroll through this all the way to the bottom, this is about 2,800 plus lines of code or of JSON definition in here. And this tells us all about the interdependencies. It has the actual raw data in here. It tells me what types of fields are associated with each thing. The config entities are in here. All of this is sitting in here for me to play with. Now, I also just wrote myself a little count script so that I could kind of see what was going on here. And that's exactly what we're going to do, is I'm just going to count all of the individual items in the model A JSON. And you can see there are 37 different entities collaborating together in order to make this happen. Now, why is that less than the articles that I talked about initially? Well, it's because these are very simple data models. They don't have any extra field values of any sort to them. They're just chained dependencies. So what I'm actually asking for here is the org. I'm asking for the organizational node, and it navigates down into the project because there's an entity reference there, and then it navigates down into all of the tasks because there are entity references there, and it pulls all of this data across. Because in order to recreate that organization from like the perspective of where I spend most of my time, I would need to pull across all of that data, okay? Now, let's go look at the other example. I also have these model Bs. And so you can see I have an organizational model B for Acquia in here as well. If I come in here and I look at it, you'll see, obviously I stuck a view here because I didn't have any field references. So if I hit edit on Acquia, it's just that. It's just a title and body. That's all it is. There's no entity reference here. And if I come into the project and we edit it, you'll see it has a reference back to its organization. Okay, cool. And if I come to any one of these tasks and I edit them, you'll see they have a reference back to their project. So all the way down, I'm kind of building this relationship back up to where I started. And there are things about this that are actually not as easy as I'd like, obviously, because I wanted to actually create administrative details of this, since I no longer have at my disposal something like inline entity form. Like, I have to be a little savvy about this. And I think this is a place where, as a community, we could come together and build some tools for this. In fact, in Drupal 6 and Drupal 7, I was already doing this, and I had tools that could do this via Page Manager, and I just haven't brought them forward to Drupal 8. But if I click Add Project here, you'll see it auto-references Acquia, and I could just create a new project, and it'll get assigned to this org right away. And if we come into the project, I have an add task here that I can do, and you'll see it's the same sort of thing. It's referencing my project automatically. I can't edit it. It was passed along my URL here. So you can see that, you know, it's node 7 add task. So that's kind of like how I'm structuring this in order to make it work. But, you know, then the visualization is actually coming out through views, and you pretty much have to do this since there's no field reference for it. So I'll just kind of do the quick compare and contrast here. We also have a model B YAML, which is still just referencing the org node, but it's referencing the model B org node. And so in that case, if we look at the JSON here, you'll see that this one is actually about half as long. It's 1,300 lines. And there's really very little difference between these entity models, except where I chose to place the references and what those references actually imply and mean. So think of it in these terms. Could an organization stand alone without its projects? Yeah, it absolutely could. That's meaningful on its own. It's isolated in such a way that we understand it. Could a project stand alone without its organization? Probably not. That would be really confusing if it could. So the dependency in terms of like, even at the human level of communication kind of implies that the project needs to know about its organization, not the other way around. So I'll do the count here real quick, just so we can see this one as well. So I've got this model B, and we'll see that it's a difference of 19 entities to 37 entities. And so there's much less data for me to actually push around in this case if it's in my scenario. So having said all of that, let me come back to the session here. And we'll open it up for questions. I think Dan had a question that I want to go ahead and address first. So Dan, I'm just going to read your question. You said, can you talk about custom field plugins more, and if and how they would replace the groups of field patterns that paragraphs use, such as a list of callout entities that might include header, field, and body fields? Sure. So I'm probably not going to get all of that perfect, Dan, so please feel free to like unmute and guide me towards the answer you're looking for. But you know, obviously we can build custom field types. Those field types can have whatever sort of normal primitives that we think of as our fields today, right? So in that sense, like, what do you mean by a callout entity?
Sorry, I mean, you can use the thing that you just did with like, if you wanted to do that in a custom field type, where you had the project was a field and it had like a couple fields on it, like I don't know, a couple text fields in it. And you wanted that all to be in one entity or something.
Yeah, well, so the thing to always keep in mind, I guess, is like cardinality answers a lot of these questions. If you look at something and you say like, let's use like my users and department reference like example from earlier. You know, if I have a list of users and their corresponding department, like we can conceptually conceive of that as being like, well, maybe we have as many of these as we want, right? It's an unlimited field value. And that's okay to kind of consider. But if we're going to do that, we want to know, like, is it ever unlimited within the field value? So like, could a person exist in multiple departments? If a person only ever exists in one department, then this is like a unit that you can build as its own custom field, and it's perfectly sensible, right? I think if we start getting into things like, you say header here, and I'm maybe conflating that with layout. Do you mean something about layout here or no?
No, so sorry. I was not trying to make it complicated, but like, let's say you have an article and then you have sections of an article, and an article has an image and a piece of text or whatever. Like there's multiple fields and you could have any number of them on an article page. The order is whatever the order is, but the layout isn't really important. Like, can you have the image and the field be a single field entity? And then, like, is that what you're saying when you say a custom field type?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying like, if I have data that looks like it goes together, you know, if you would build a paragraph and associate multiple pieces of data, like add multiple fields within that paragraph bundle, that's a point in time where you can stop and say, should this be a custom field? Because there's a significant possibility that the answer is yes. If you're doing that, then you could actually just deploy the field to the entity and attach it directly. And you're going to have a much cleaner data storage for that, because it'll deploy two tables. It'll be one table for the field and one table for the field revisions if the entity you're adding it to is revisionable, right? And so now you're really only ever storing the data that went into that field, and you're only modifying that data as you interact with the node. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think conceptually, we probably, you know, there's other questions, so I can figure out the details later. But yeah, I was not aware that that was optional.
Okay, cool.
Well, we've got about minutes before our session close here.
How many minutes?
About 3 minutes for our session ending here. So there's a couple of questions that are on deck in the chat. If people have further follow-up, we can take it over to Slack for that, or use one of the rooms that is not being used right now, like the hallway chat. So
yep.
So there's a couple of those questions there. Do you want to tackle one of them, or?
Yeah. So, David, I think I'm gonna like paint with a really broad brushstroke here, which I know probably isn't good enough. But I mentioned earlier that we should be looking to make like field composition easier within probably Drupal core, so that we don't need something like paragraphs. So I guess what I'm saying here is that I think that and this maybe touches a little bit on the next question because they're asking about multi-field in V7. Like we should probably figure out how it is that we can generate new field type plugins without generating new content entities to store all their data, which is kind of what paragraphs does. And I think there's another way to go about this that would be much more raw in the data sense. And that's like the world that I think we should be looking towards. But you know, like my example of the project management tool, I think still really stands. Like this is a thing that people should be aware of. The decisions you make around where we put entity reference fields, they really do matter in the long term. And you know, clearly you guys were looking at that with your approach as well. So let me run through my last two slides real quick, and then I'll hop over to the hallway chat for anybody who wants to kind of engage further. So please, please, please provide feedback. Top-rated sessions are going to be captioned, and you can find mine at this URL, which of course is not easy to click. And please come to the contribution day on Saturday. I know many of you have done that for a very long time, and it'd be great to see this continue to succeed even while we're doing it here in a virtual format. So thank you everybody for your time. I really appreciate it.